Imagine waking up one morning and the entire world has decided you are guilty of something you did not do. You are 9 years old. You do not fully understand what has happened. Your little sister is gone. Your family is falling apart. And instead of people wrapping their arms around your family, they are pointing fingers, whispering behind closed doors, and printing your name in newspapers across the country. That is a reality Burke Ramsey lived through. And for 28 years, he said nothing. He stayed quiet while the world kept talking. But now, after nearly 3 decades of silence, Burke has finally spoken. And what is shared has left people across the world completely stunned. This is a story of a case that has haunted America for over a quarter of a century. A case that started on the night of December 25th, 1996, when a 6-year-old girl named JonBenét Ramsey went to sleep in her family home in Boulder, Colorado, and never woke up. What followed was one of the most chaotic, heartbreaking, and deeply mishandled criminal investigations in modern American history. And even today, in 2024, nobody has ever been convicted. Nobody has ever been brought to justice. The case remains open, and the little girl's family is still searching for answers. So today, we are going to take you through everything. We will walk you through what happened that terrible night in December. We will explore the investigation that followed, the mistakes that were made, and the suspicion that unfairly landed on the Ramsey family. We will talk about what Burke finally revealed after all these years, what his father John has been fighting for, and why there may be more hope now than ever before, thanks to breakthroughs in DNA technology that simply did not exist when this tragedy first unfolded. Stay with us, because this story is unlike anything else you have ever heard. Christmas of 1996 was supposed to be a magical evening for the Ramsey family. They were a wealthy, well-known family in Boulder. John Ramsey ran a successful technology company, and the family lived in a large, beautiful home in one of the nicest neighborhoods in the city. JonBenét, their youngest child, was a bright and bubbly 6-year-old with golden curls and a personality that seemed to light up every room she entered. She had been participating in children's beauty pageants. And to those who knew her, she was so much more than a contestant. She was a curious, joyful child who loved her family deeply. That Christmas evening, the family had attended a small party and returned home late. The children were put to bed. The house grew quiet. And then, sometime in the hours that followed, something truly terrible happened inside those walls. When Patsy Ramsey woke up early on the morning of December 26th, she made her way downstairs. What she found stopped her cold. Lying on the staircase was a long, handwritten note. The note claimed that JonBenét had been taken. It said she had been kidnapped by a small foreign group and demanded exactly $118,000 for her return. Patsy immediately ran to check her daughter's room. The bed was empty. JonBenét was gone. In a panic, Patsy called 911. Her voice, still captured in that recording, is the voice of a mother who is absolutely terrified. Police arrived at the home quickly. Friends and family were called. People gathered inside the house. And here is where the investigation began to go wrong almost immediately. The Boulder Police Department, which was not especially experienced in handling homicide cases of this magnitude, did not treat the home as a proper crime scene from the start. People walked in and out. Items were touched and moved. Potential evidence was disturbed before it could be properly documented. For 6 full hours after police arrived, nobody searched the entire house thoroughly. Nobody went into the basement. Nobody found JonBenét. And then, in one of the most haunting moments in this entire case, a detective who was still present in the house casually suggested to John Ramsey that he go look around and check if anything seemed unusual. John went downstairs into the basement, and there, in a small wine cellar room, he found his daughter. She was lying on the floor, her wrists bound, a piece of tape across her mouth. JonBenét was gone. In his shock and grief, John picked her up and carried her body upstairs, forever altering the crime scene in a way that could never be undone. Forensic experts who have analyzed this case for years will tell you that the decision to allow John to find the body and the failure to preserve the scene in those critical early hours did enormous damage to the investigation. Evidence that might have told investigators exactly what happened was lost, contaminated, or destroyed before anyone truly understood what they were dealing with. From the very first days after JonBenét's body was found, the Boulder Police Department made a decision that would define the entire case for the next 3 decades. Rather than casting a wide net and following the evidence wherever it led, investigators very quickly zeroed in on the family itself. John and Patsy Ramsey became the primary focus of suspicion before a proper investigation had even begun. There were reasons investigators looked at the family, at least on the surface. There was no clear sign of forced entry into the home, which made some officers skeptical that an intruder had gotten in. The ransom note was unusually long, almost theatrical, and had been written on paper from inside the house using one of Patsy's own notepads. The dollar amount demanded matched almost exactly a recent bonus John had received at work. To investigators who were already looking in one direction, these details seemed to confirm what they already suspected. But here's what made things deeply problematic. In focusing so intensely on the Ramseys, police were not doing the hard work of looking elsewhere. Tips came in from various sources. There were names, leads, and theories that pointed away from the family entirely. These were often ignored or not pursued with any real urgency. And when a detective named Lou Smith came in to review the evidence, he came to a very different conclusion from the rest of the team. Lou Smith was not a rookie. He had solved more than 200 homicide cases during his career. He was known for being methodical, careful, and willing to follow the evidence rather than his gut feeling. When he reviewed everything collected from the Ramsey home, he became increasingly convinced that an intruder had entered the house that night. He pointed to scuff marks on a wall near one of the basement windows. He noted a suitcase positioned below that window in a way that suggested someone had used it to climb out. He highlighted physical evidence on JonBenét's body that he believed could have been caused by a stun gun, suggesting a level of premeditation and planning that did not fit the theory of a family member suddenly snapping. But Smith's conclusions were not welcomed by the Boulder police. Instead of seriously considering another direction, the department treated his findings with hostility. He was dismissed. He was mocked. And after about a year of being sidelined and ignored, Lou Smith resigned from the case in frustration. In his resignation letter, which became public, he made clear that he believed the Ramseys were innocent and that someone else had committed the crime. He did not stop working on the case, though. He kept investigating privately until the very end of his life. Meanwhile, the media had latched onto the story with an intensity that was difficult to describe. Within days of JonBenét's death, photographs of her in pageant makeup and formal dresses were being broadcast across national television. The images were striking and unusual, and they became the lens through which the entire case was viewed. Instead of being seen as a grieving family, the Ramseys were portrayed as people who had put their daughter in an inappropriate spotlight. Critics called the pageants exploitative. They questioned Patsy's motivations. They speculated publicly about what kind of environment JonBenet had grown up in. John Ramsey has spoken about this many times in the years since. He has said that people were wrong about what those pageants meant to JonBenet. His daughter loved the dressing up, the performing, the excitement of it all. It was never something forced on her. It was something she genuinely enjoyed. But the narrative had already been written by the time anyone asked the family to explain themselves. And once a narrative takes hold in the media, it is almost impossible to reverse. For all of these years, one person stayed almost entirely silent. Burke Ramsey, who was 9 years old the night his sister was taken, grew up in the shadow of one of the most talked about unsolved crimes in American history. He went to school, he made a life for himself, he became a software engineer, and he did his best to stay out of the public eye completely. But the world never truly let him go. Over the years, people speculated about Burke constantly. Why had he supposedly slept through everything? Why didn't he come out of his room? Some people went further and suggested that he might have accidentally hurt JonBenet and that the parents had covered it up. These were theories without a shred of supporting evidence, but they circulated widely, fueled by a public that had become almost obsessed with the case. Burke eventually decided he had heard enough. He sat down for an interview with Dr. Phil, and what came out of that conversation was raw, emotional, and deeply personal. This was not a polished press appearance. This was a man who had spent nearly his entire life carrying an unimaginable weight, finally trying to set the record straight. He talked about what it was like to be a 9-year-old child in the middle of that storm. He talked about the confusion of that night, lying in his room, hearing sounds downstairs, not knowing what was happening. He described the fear of not understanding. A child hearing commotion in the middle of the night is scared. He did not know if there was a dangerous person in the house. He did not know what to do, so he stayed in his room, as many frightened children would. Burke talked about his sister's funeral, about standing at the front of the church and looking at her casket and not fully understanding what death meant at that age. He described a moment where his father leaned down and told him that JonBenét was now in heaven. And when his father broke down crying, Burke cried too, not because he understood everything that had happened, but because he could see his father's pain, and he felt it too. That image of a father and son crying together at the funeral of a 6-year-old girl is almost too painful to sit with. He spoke about the years that followed, about seeing newspaper headlines accusing him of things he never did. One day, a young Burke was at a grocery store with his family and saw his own name in a headline on the front of a tabloid, with accusations printed right there in bold letters for everyone to see. He broke down crying in the middle of the store. His parents did their best to shield him. But how do you truly protect a child from something like that? How do you explain to your son that the world thinks he did something terrible when you know he is innocent? When people ask Burke directly whether he had anything to do with his sister's death, his answer is immediate and firm. Absolutely not. Not a chance. He was a 9-year-old child who adored his little sister. The idea that he hurt her is, in his words, completely false. And yet, he had to live with those accusations hanging over him for decades. One thing people commented on widely after the interview aired was Burke's facial expressions. At certain moments, he appeared to smile slightly while discussing painful topics. Behavioral experts weighed in and explained that this is actually a well-documented human response to extreme discomfort and stress. It is not a sign of happiness or indifference. It is what some people do when they are nervous, when they are trying to hold themselves together in an emotionally overwhelming situation. To read it as anything more sinister is a significant misunderstanding of how people actually respond to trauma. While Burke carried the quiet burden of having been in that house as a child, his father John carried an entirely different kind of weight. John Ramsey lost his daughter. Then he watched his wife, Patsy, be publicly accused of the most terrible crime a mother could commit. He watched her fight that accusation every single day while also battling ovarian cancer. And then in 2006, Patsy died. She passed away without ever knowing who had killed her child. John has described that loss as something that never truly heals. Patsy spent her final years with two enormous shadows over her: the grief of losing JonBenét and the injustice of being suspected of causing it. She never got to see her name fully cleared. She never got to know the truth. And John carries the weight of that every day. What John has been most vocal about in recent years is not grief, though it is something more active. He is fighting. He is fighting for access to the DNA evidence that was collected from JonBenét's body and clothing all those years ago and has sat largely untested in the Boulder Police Department's evidence room ever since. Here is what makes this so significant. In 2008, a district attorney reviewed new DNA testing results and announced that DNA from an unknown male had been found on JonBenét's clothing. That DNA did not match anyone in the Ramsey family. It belonged to someone else entirely. The district attorney at the time issued a formal apology to the Ramsey family, acknowledging that the evidence did not support the theories that had targeted them for so many years. It was a step in the right direction, but it was only a step. That DNA still belonged to an unknown person. It had not led to an arrest. It had not led to a name. And in the years that followed, the case once again fell into silence. Then something happened in 2018 that reignited John Ramsey's hope. Law enforcement in California used a brand new type of DNA analysis called genetic genealogy to arrest a man who had been linked to a series of brutal crimes going back 40 years. The technique worked by comparing the suspect's DNA against databases of voluntary submissions and then tracing family trees to narrow down potential identities. It was painstaking work, but it produced results that traditional forensic methods had never been able to deliver. John heard about this breakthrough and immediately thought of his daughter. He visited one of the laboratories that specializes in this kind of work. He sat down with experts and learned just how powerful this technology had become. A single DNA sample could now be compared against millions of genetic data points, building a family tree, tracing relatives, narrowing down suspects in ways that were simply impossible in 1996. John came away from that meeting with a renewed sense of purpose. He was convinced that if the DNA evidence from JonBenét's case were submitted to this kind of modern analysis, there was a real chance of finding a match. A real chance of finally knowing who had been in that house. But the Boulder Police Department has refused to allow it. This is perhaps one of the most frustrating parts of this entire story. John Ramsey has been asking for years to have the DNA evidence retested using modern technology. He is not asking for something unreasonable. He is not asking for anything that would harm the investigation. He is asking for the evidence to be examined by qualified experts using tools that are more advanced than anything that existed when the original testing was done. And yet, he keeps getting told no. John believes the reason for this refusal is deeply tied to the original failure of the investigation. The detectives who handled the case from the beginning built their theories around the idea that the Ramsey family was responsible. If new DNA testing were to identify someone completely outside the family, someone who had never been on law enforcement's radar, it would expose just how completely wrong those early investigators had been. It would raise serious questions about how the case was handled for decades. And John believed that protecting that legacy is more important to some people than finding the truth. He has said this directly and without hesitation. He believes there are people in the Boulder Police Department who would rather the case stay unsolved than be forced to admit that they spent 30 years looking in the wrong direction. Out of desperation and a determination that is not dimmed with age, John did something remarkable. He launched a public petition calling on the governor of Colorado to intervene and order the police to release the DNA samples for modern testing. The petition gained significant attention. When John looked at the comments section, he was moved. Thousands of ordinary people had signed their names and written their own messages, many of them saying essentially the same thing. A child was killed. Everything possible must be done to find the person responsible. Do not let this case disappear. In the midst of all this, a powerful thread from the past continues to weave its way through the present. Lou Smith, the detective who resigned from the official investigation because he believed the Ramseys were innocent, did not take his work with him to the grave. Before he died in 2010, Lou had assembled an enormous collection of materials. Thousands of tips, hundreds of leads, photographs, documents, notes, a list of potential suspects that the official investigation had never seriously pursued. Lou handed all of this to his daughter, Cindy, and Cindy has not let it gather dust. She has continued her father's work quietly and carefully. She has been tracking down individuals on that suspect list and, where possible, obtaining DNA samples for comparison. Her goal is clear. If John Ramsey ever succeeds in getting access to the unidentified male DNA from JonBenét's clothing, Cindy wants to have samples ready for comparison from every person her father identified as a possible suspect. Lou Smith believed until the day he died that a stranger had entered the Ramsey home that night. He believed the crime was a result of a failed kidnapping, a plan that went terribly wrong. And he believed that the person responsible was still out there somewhere, having lived with what they did for all these years, while an innocent family was blamed. Cindy carries her father's conviction with her. She has described the work as a promise she made to him. She will not stop until there are answers, or until every possible lead has been exhausted. DNA experts who work in the field of genetic genealogy have spoken about the JonBenét case with great interest. One prominent expert in the field has described the science as fundamentally different from what existed in the 1990s. Back then, DNA analysis was essentially a matching tool. You collected a sample, you compared to known suspects, and if there was no match, you had nothing. The science went nowhere. Today, that has changed completely. Modern analysis can examine over 1 million individual data points within a single DNA sample. Those points can be compared against genetic databases to find partial matches, which can then be used to trace family trees and ultimately identify an individual, even if that person has never had their DNA collected by law enforcement. The science has solved cold cases that seem completely hopeless. It has brought justice in situations where investigators had given up decades earlier. If applied to the evidence from JonBenét's case, experts believe there is genuine reason for hope. The sample that exists is real. It was collected. It belongs to someone. And that someone has family members. Those family members may be in databases. The technology exists to find them. 28 years is a long time. JonBenét Ramsey would have been 35 years old today. She would have had a whole life. She might have had a family of her own. She might have gone to college, traveled the world, found work she loved, built something beautiful with the years she never got to have. Instead, she remains in the public memory as a 6-year-old in a pageant dress, a child who became famous for the worst possible reason. The case has never been solved. There has never been an arrest. There has never been a trial. There has never been a moment where John Ramsey could stand in a courtroom and watch someone be held accountable for what happened to his daughter. That absence of justice is something he lives with every single day. But here is what this case also represents beyond the tragedy of one family. It is a lesson in how quickly suspicion can overwhelm the process of finding truth. The Boulder police, under enormous public pressure, made the mistake of deciding too early who they thought was responsible. Once that decision was made, it became nearly impossible to look in other directions. Evidence that might have pointed elsewhere was overlooked. Leads that did not fit the existing theory were ignored. And a family that should have been supported through one of the worst experiences imaginable was instead treated like criminals. This kind of tunnel vision is not unique to this case. It happens in investigations around the world, but rarely has it been so clearly demonstrated, and rarely have the consequences been so devastating and so public. What Burke's decision to speak out has done is force people to reconsider. Not because Burke revealed some dramatic new piece of evidence. He did not. But because hearing him speak, hearing the pain and the confusion, and the sense of loss in his voice, reminds people that the Ramseys were not just characters in a crime story. They were a family, a real family who lost a child and then lost 28 years of their lives to suspicion they did not deserve. And what John's ongoing fight for DNA testing represents is something powerful too. It is a refusal to give up. It is a father saying, with whatever time he has left, that he will not stop until someone is held accountable. Not for revenge, not for his own comfort, but because his daughter deserved better. Because the little girl who loved dressing up and performing and making people smile deserved to have someone stand up for her. There's a reason people are still watching videos about JonBenét Ramsey in 2024. It is not just morbid curiosity. It is something deeper than that. There is something about unresolved injustice that refuses to let go of the human conscience. When a child is hurt and no one is ever held responsible, the story stays open. It refuses to close. And something in us knows that it should not close until it is resolved properly. Every new development in this case, every interview Burke gives, every public statement from John, every petition that circulates asking for DNA evidence to be retested brings thousands of people back to that December night in 1996 and asks the same question. What really happened? The Boulder police have confirmed that the case remains officially open. There are detectives still assigned to it. There's still a file. There's still evidence in a storage room somewhere that has not yet told us everything it knows. The investigation, imperfect as it has been, has not ended. And with DNA technology advancing at a pace that would have seemed like science fiction 30 years ago, the idea that this case might one day be solved is not wishful thinking. It is a genuine possibility. Cases far older than this one have been resolved through genetic genealogy. Killers who believe they had escaped justice permanently have been identified and arrested. Families who spent decades without answers have finally received them. JonBenét's family deserves that too. Burke deserves it. John deserves it. And most of all, a little girl named JonBenét, who never got to grow up, deserves it. Burke Ramsey spent 28 years carrying something most of us will never understand. He was a child when tragedy struck. He grew up under suspicion. He built a quiet life, a professional career, a private existence. And then he decided to speak. Not because he had all the answers. Not because there was some new explosive revelation to make. But because after nearly 3 decades, the silence had become something he was no longer willing to carry alone. What he shared was simple and human. He remembered his sister. He remembered her laugh, her energy, the way she filled a room. He remembered standing at her funeral, too young to fully understand what he was seeing. He remembered crying with his father. He remembered a childhood that was taken from both of them, one through death, and one through the way of a world that decided to look at him with suspicion instead of compassion. His words remind us that behind every crime story, behind every headline, behind every true crime documentary and podcast and YouTube video, there are real people. There are families. There are children who grow up haunted by things they had no control over. There are parents who go to their graves without the answers they spent their whole lives searching for. JonBenét Ramsey deserves justice. That is not a complicated idea. It is a simple one. A child was taken. Someone is responsible. And the tools exist today that might finally be able to tell us who that someone is, if the people who hold the evidence would only allow the science to do its work. John Ramsey has said he does not know if it will ever be solved. He said it quietly, in a voice full of exhaustion and sorrow. But he also said he will keep pushing for as long as he is alive. And somewhere in a laboratory that deals in the language of DNA and genetic trees and cold case breakthroughs, there may be a scientist ready to prove him right. JonBenét would have been 35 this year. Remember her not just as a case. Remember her as a child. Remember her as a daughter and a sister. And remember that justice, no matter how long it takes, is never truly out of reach. If this story moved you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. And click on the next video because there is so much more to uncover.